Hello everyone, thank you for coming to the second day of the Future Life conference here at IMPAKT. Today's panel and events are focused around the biological side. So it's future biological life. Can we switch over to the slide? Future biological life, human and non-human life. And we've got a slide there of our Archaea bot, which I made with Alex May through an EMAP residency, which brings a lot of these kind of future life ideas together, and I guess was the starting point for organising this series of events. It's based on the most ancient life form on Earth, an Archaea, but it contains cutting-edge artificial intelligence, and it's a robot inspired by the work of Imperial College on the Mara project, and our collaborator Amanda Wilson, who's actually trying to make biological robots using something called DNA origami, where you can actually sculpt with DNA to create actual biological attachments for bacteria and things. So I'm really inspired by this quote, and I think this kind of draws this thread across time that I'm really interested in. The farther back you can look, the farther forward you're likely to see. And it's a quote by Winston Churchill, but not the British Prime Minister that everyone thinks it is. It's always wrongly attributed to him. It's a US author who was born 3 years before Winston Churchill. And when you see that on the internet, it's probably fake news. It's probably misattributed, which is one of these things where we need to kind of look back. But a lot of things throughout history have repeated themselves, even things about the climate. We go through these phases, and I think if we have this long-term understanding of things, we could kind of try and avoid making some of the mistakes we make. I've done a lot of work with synthetic biology, and this is a piece that I made with the University of California, Irvine, in the Leo Lab for Synthetic Evolution, where they work with non-canonical amino acids. So all living things, there are 64 amino acids in the world, and all living things are made with a combination of 20. Or all natural living things. But some of the living things that they work with, there's some of the antibodies and things like that, are made with 21 amino acids, sometimes 22, 23. And this necklace that I made plays with this metaphor that they talk about amino acids forming in chains. And it's actually an engineered antibody it's based on that binds very well to HIV. So each of these beads physically contains the amino acid in the sequence, so in a crystallized form, in the exact order, and this weird looping effect is the actual protein structure. So I have it on good authority from the lab director that you could actually reconstruct this engineered antibody from my necklace. Actually, you've got all the information and mediums that you need. And I've worked a lot with synthetic biology, again with this piece, which is related to it, where we actually took the that little engineered antibody, and we inserted it into the genome of an E. coli bacteria. And then we also had one amino acid change in it. So they have this way that DNA replicates. You have these stop codons, which tell it to stop replicating at some point. And it depends on this one amino acid difference, depends on whether the bacteria, which are exactly the same bacteria, grow white or grow blue on this X-gal agar solution. So it's really interesting, this huge change just from this one tiny edit. And I've worked with CRISPR DNA editing. So CRISPR technology is this, it stands for clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats, which basically means little tiny bits of DNA that appear in living organisms throughout the genomes, in kind of almost, anyway, living organisms. And that we can use them, now we've discovered them, to kind of cut and paste DNA more easily than we could before. Now, the hype says it's easy to cut and paste DNA, and it's fast and it's quick. It's very fiddly. It takes 3 months instead of 3 years now. It's easier. It's not easy. It's very fiddly. It's mostly spending weeks and weeks and weeks with a pipette going like that, with amounts that you can't even see. But in this piece, I edited the DNA of an E. coli bacterium to remove an antibiotic resistance gene, and the piece was in the bacteria was then grown into this wartime suit, which was a controlled commodity at the time. It had a UK government mark on it that said controlled commodity 1941, and that's the year that the antibiotic age started. 1941 was when the first trials of penicillin in humans happened, and they weren't controlled commodities because we now have this huge issue of antibiotic resistance, which we'll be talking about a lot more later. So I just wanted to raise that. It went too fast. And again, with this idea of the pandemics, we have these pandemics that could come and possibly wipe us out as well. We kind of forget this bacterium that I've embroidered on this antique linen nightgown is Yersinia pestis plague. And it's actually impregnated with the DNA of plague. And we forget that plague killed off half the population of Europe at one point, and half the population of China at one point as well. So it's really had an enormous impact on society. In Madagascar now, there is drug-resistant plague. It's resistant to several antibiotics. So we shouldn't be complacent about these things. And currently on show in the Guangzhou Triennial in China, on the largest port on the Silk Road, largest maritime port on the Silk Road, which it used to be called Canton in olden days. And this is on show there, and it's the Silk Route was one of the vectors of plague when it travelled to Europe from the Eurasian steppes. So this is a silk dress, 1665 dress design, which is the Great Plague of London, with original embroidery. So they're actual of the era embroideries that I managed to source and attached it, impregnated with plague DNA that I extracted in a category. Well, I extracted in the National Collection of Type Cultures in Public Health England. And so the questions for today's panel that we're going to be dealing with and wrestling with are things like, what is the role of humanity in climate change? And I was very inspired by this question raised by David Sapolsky at a previous conference I went to. Are we the meteorite or are we the dinosaurs in this scenario of this end of the world scenario? Are we the things being wiped out or are we the cause of it? Or are we both? Do bacteria rule the world? I think there'll be more on that with the keynote later, which you must stay for. It'll be amazing. What will the impact of synthetic biology be? We had a film on that the first night of the panel, where people said it is revolutionizing the world. So let's discuss that. As I've hinted, will a new pandemic come and wipe out human life or other life on Earth? We've got a plant scientist on the panel as well, who I hope will be touching on other organisms. And how will life on Earth co-evolve with new technologies, and what will the ethical implications of that be? So I'd like to invite up the first speaker, which is Professor Freek Hoebeek, who's going to swap over his presentation. Professor Hoebeek, I need a mic.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. Professor Hoebeek is at the University of Utrecht Medical Centre. He's the chair of translational research in early life events. And we collaborated with him, Alex and I, on another robotic project, biocomputation robots, inspired by his research and his collaboration with another colleague of ours, Professor Volker Stuber at the University of Hertfordshire. And we're going to be demoing those biocomputation robots after this panel. So stay around and play with them. They're quite cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for this introduction, also the invitation to speak here. Also, I'm very interested in those robots. I haven't seen them yet, only upstairs actually in bubble wrap, so curious. So as a short pitch to introduce you in the science that we do, I cooked up this presentation, short, 3 slides only, and the title says, "Is there a light at the end of the tunnel?" But it's about neurostimulation. Just to give you a little bit of a hint of an idea of what we're doing, is to first show you this picture. This is functional neurosurgery in the 1950s. This is, I think we can see the monitor. So this is Professor Irving Cooper, and he's there performing one of the earliest surgeries to cure somebody's Parkinson's disease. And at that time, that was done by just infusing alcohol into the subthalamic nucleus, a small part of your brain, and that cured some parts of the Parkinson's, of the tremor at least. Now, you can see that the hand was held, the patient was actually awake. Luckily, neurosurgery came a long way, right? So we don't do this anymore. Nowadays, what neurostimulation looks like, it's actually a device which is implanted. So the generator is as a pacemaker, it's implanted subcutaneously, and the leads will be implanted into an area of the brain which needs to be stimulated. And these type of machines can actually also listen to the brain first, and then upon the computation of an algorithm, which is implanted also in that generator, the machine will decide yes or no, we're going to stimulate your brain. For what type of diseases is this used by now? It's a whole list. So movement disorders as Parkinson's, also epilepsy, pain, depression, Gilles de la Tourette, obsessive compulsive disorder, tinnitus, and the list is building up. Almost every year there are new clinical safety trials started who are saying, well, look, can we use neurostimulation? We're still not there yet, because this works with electricity. We use electricity to stimulate the brain, and we let a generator then decide whether or not we should stimulate. But what are we doing there? Actually, if you would infuse electricity into this neural system, you would stimulate everything. There is no sort of selectivity in what you're actually stimulating. You're going to stimulate every single part of this neural network. And all these diseases that I showed you, they are known for being very specific. In certain subtypes of your brain will dysfunction. The rest is fine. It's just one small part which is has an issue with programming. So for instance here, what we would like to do maybe to save your epilepsy, to cure it, is to stimulate only the green cells, to control their activity, but not the activity of the other parts. That can be done nowadays. So this is the difference. This is electrical stimulation. Right? So you will activate both cells here by infusing electricity. Optogenetics, that has been the trick. Now you can actually stimulate only one cell. Right? You can only stimulate the upper one, but not the lower one. This gives us selectivity of how to control brain activity. Where do we get that from, optogenetics? It's taken from algae, which live in the sea, very dark down. They also need to know where is up and where is down. So they actually have light-sensitive ion channels in their membranes. So they can see where up and down is, so where the sun comes from. That light-sensitive ion channel is actually stripped from the DNA and can be put into neurons nowadays. So you can, through viral vectors and gene transcription, you can actually put that into specific neurons in the brain. And that will give us the opportunity to actually selectively stimulate brain cells. For what can we use it? Well, for all the diseases beforehand. But so as I put here, seizure intervention, learning, self-physiology, the whole list is there, and it can increase for a very long time. But it does need a lot of work. And we can only do that, really intervene in these neural networks, if we know what to change in the activity of the neural network. Not just go in and stimulate away. We need to know what we're doing. Otherwise, we don't know the side effects. That was the presentation I wanted to give you now, and I'm very much looking forward to your response about what we can do with this and how we can foresee where this is going. Okay.
Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Martijntje Smits, who is an engineer and philosopher of technology. He's currently writing a book at the moment on Frankenstein. She's a curator of science as well, and also working on a project now, an art and science project entitled Endless Life. So very fitting to have her here today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, you just had a nice quote, Anna. The farther back you can look, the farther forward you are likely to see. So I want to start with looking back. Does anyone of you recognize this picture? Oh, Ine recognizes it. It's 200 years old, or almost. It's the front page of the second edition of Frankenstein in 1831. It was published first in 1818. And it's this picture says all I want to say today. It's about life, in fact. It's about the meaning of life. As a philosopher, my main message for today would be that we should think about what life is. That normally when we talk about the future of life, we often think to know what life is. Biologists have a certain definition of life. It's about growing and metabolizing, etc. But it would be my statement that our ideas about life and death are continually shifting, also due to technological developments. And it's not a descriptive concept, but it's a very normative concept. Life is good, death is bad, so to say. This Mr. Frankenstein was heavily obsessed with life and with creating life. In fact, he's the icon, the central symbol maybe of modern science. He was obsessed with the idea that we should not be dependent on biology for being alive. And so he tried to create life by way of science and technology. And then, in fact, it turned around. He became heavily dependent on technology for living. Well, what happens in this picture? You all know the story of the film. Frankenstein is making a monster. The monster awakens. And the monster turns out to be a murderous being, and he kills several people, and then you have to kill the monster to stop the evil. In the book, the story is very different. In fact, it has a very different message. And the key moment is here. Frankenstein has been obsessively making this creature from body parts found on graveyards, etc., and with a bit of electricity, etc. It starts to move. And at this moment, when it starts to move, Frankenstein turns around. He is suddenly very anxious, and he just runs away, and he doesn't meet the monster. After 2 years, he meets the monster at last in the mountains, and then the monster asks him, "Help me, I want to be in this world, I want to live, help me learn this world, you have denied me, you have denied your own creature." And what it tells me there are two central drives within Dr. Frankenstein. The one is the Utopian Drive. So the idea that by way of science and technology we can improve the world, and we can improve our health, and we can we somehow get independent of biology. And the other drive is the dystopian drive, I would say, so that our independence, our dependence on technology gets the main source of fear. So technology is seen as a kind of autonomous force which comes to us as a natural force, and we can just adopt to it, but we don't have a choice anymore. I call this the utopia-dystopia syndrome, and I think it's very much within our cultural narratives, this idea of salvation by way of technology and also doom by way of science and technology. The message is as well that in both of these ideas, these narratives, utopia and dystopia, somehow technology and nature are seen as the things opposed to us. So nature is not us, but it's the other. And technology is the other. It's the strange thing we have to dominate somehow. And it's exactly that what in the novel of Mary Shelley is turned around. In her most important message is that there's a relation, always a relation between humans and technology, and with humans and nature. And it's exactly this relationship that makes us responsible. And this is, well, I can elucidate that because my time is over, but it's exactly that we are strangers for ourselves as well. So we are nature and technology and human all the time. That makes, and also the other is not the other, but the other has also all these components, and it's exactly that makes that we have the duty to form a common world and to do politics with each other and to be responsible. Well, I can imagine that these are small, big steps. I can elucidate it further if you like, but that's my message for today.
And then I'd like to welcome up Chris Bisson from Eden Project. Eden Project is, he's going to tell us all about it, but it's an amazing, stunning place where they've just built a new museum of invisible worlds, which has a wet lab in it as well, which Chris leads. So he's going to explain to us about all that. Do you need a hand?
Yes. Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me here, Anna. So I'm from Cornwall in the southwest of the UK, and I'm from a place called the Eden Project. So as with kind of the post-apocalyptic title of this whole event, I wanted to start off with this slide here. So this is what the Eden Project used to look like, and I imagine in the future, and, well, there's areas of the planet that do look like this, that are completely despoiled by industry, by mining, by deforestation. But for this talk today, I kind of wanted to work a bit further backwards. So this is what Eden looks like now. Well, this is 10 years after that picture there. And the great thing is to kind of add a bit of... humans are pretty persistent things, persistent, but unfortunately quite responsive. So generally we won't really do anything until we actually need to do something. And this is something that we're trying to address here at Eden. So basically, Eden used to be a china clay pit. So going back to there, which is very reminiscent of some sort of post-apocalyptic landscape. And this is something that humans have done to the environment. Clay is really tricky soil to work with. It has a horrible relationship with water, where it basically holds water and then slips. And it's been an absolute nightmare to develop anything in that. But this is something that we managed to do. So we manufactured something close to 90,000 tons of our own soil, and gone through a huge amount of scientific processes through ecological restoration to create the site that looks something similar to that today. We have the world's largest greenhouse, which is the rainforest biome. And so this slide looks very similar to that of yours yesterday, Paul, of some of the images and the books that you showed for the future. It kind of feels like I live in there because I spend a lot of time at work, but I probably wouldn't want to live in there at the moment. So at Eden, we currently have nearly 1 million visitors a year. And because we are a visitor destination as well as a botanic garden, the broad demographic of visitors that we have are really important to us. And again, this is where we start to introduce things like art into elements of our interpretation, because art is a really nice gateway for those that aren't necessarily engaged in science or engaged in the real detail of academic study. So this is one of the largest freestanding ceramic sculptures in the world. It's a piece of art called Infinity Blue, and it's basically inspired by the role that cyanobacteria have played in the evolution of life. And this can be seen, so it actually breathes oxygen, and well, it blows smoke rings. So this is part of the launch of our new Invisible Worlds gallery, in which I manage an open and wet lab, and we have all sorts of art and stuff. So we use art as part of our interpretation. And so we really try and combine the art and the science to provide our visitors with a really accessible interface between the potentially complicated things that they wouldn't normally get to access in their everyday life. But with very much the eco-optimism side of things as well. So there was, it's quite nice to feel that although, I mean, the classic thing is that humans and the work of humans has got us into this sort of Anthropocene. There are elements, I think, where we can be clever and get ourselves sort of out the other end, sort of less scathed than we were than we got through it. Does that make sense? No, sorry. But the exciting thing is that people are amazing and clever and resourceful. And I think if there was to be a world without us, I have a feeling that it would probably be closer linked to the geological cycles of the planet that we could potentially influence with elements of things like carbon, because carbon has played a massive role in all of the 5 mass extinctions in the past on the planet as well. So I guess we could discuss maybe the role of carbon and mass extinctions later on in the panel. And yes, so I won't go into your questions, Anna, but if anyone has any questions about anything, please come and grab me, and I'll be in the panel as well. So thank you very much.
So I thought I'd just throw out there then, what is the role of humanity in climate change? I think you started already on that one, really? So do you want to say something on that, Chris?
I mentioned last night, I don't know whether it's the fact that I'm getting slightly older, but I'm starting to find geology much more interesting. There was a really interesting quote from a US paleontologist called Thomas Algeo, who said that basically we are the trees of the Devonian. And for those of you that know your extinctions, it was the evolution of a type of tree that was a major vector in that mass extinction, because the fact that they were being able to lock down carbon and produce oxygen massively cooled the planet. So the meteor and dinosaur thing, I think we're as a species, we are affecting the actual systems of the planet. So through climate change and all those sorts of things. So yes, I think we've definitely increased the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. We're acidifying the oceans, but at the same time, through technology and through advances in that sort of thing, I'm relatively positive that we can reduce that but unfortunately these things and the systems do move a bit slower. I think we can reduce the amount, but to get it back to the pre-Anthropocene levels is going to take a lot of work.
Okay, and Martijntje, have you got some thoughts on that?
Well, again, my thought would very much be within the perspective from my Frankenstein story, in which in the novel it's the big question: who's guilty? Is it the human, the Frankenstein, or is it the monster, the thing we created? And the question is, in fact, the question you pose is, in fact, a political question. Is it humans? And then it implies that we are responsible and we should do something. Though I would say, is it important who's guilty of this effect? Isn't it just... maybe it's unimportant, and it's just... the message should just be that we are responsible for making the world a better place. So irrelevant whether it's the volcanoes or where the climate change comes from, we have to care for biodiversity and for people living in areas where the big floods are expected, etc. So maybe it's not the question is not important.
Okay. Thank you. And Freek, have you got any thoughts on the question of the role of humanity in climate change, or
to me, officially, that's not a question. I mean, we're leading in climate change, so we also have to solve it in order to basically save our souls. It's a bit more pragmatic.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, this sort of thing about, we talk about the world without us, and that's when we talk about saving the planet, we're not really saving the planet, we're talking about saving us, I think, is one of the interesting things, because...
yeah, but it's an anthropocentric answer you give. So you give humans... and the answer is, it seems assumed that we as humans are responsible for the Earth, which is the other, again, as the opposite of us. Though maybe, well, in my answer would be that we are not opposed, but still are responsible. So responsibility does not come from this exclusive position, but from being together.
I mean, you could argue as well that, that in some cases the bacteria are responsible, because about 10% of greenhouse gases are produced by rice paddy fields, and it's the methane-producing bacteria that live in there that are causing this. It's a foodstuff, so that tends to be eaten by people in poorer parts of the world. So there's less talk about that than there is about the kind of animal side of it with the agriculture, other forms of agriculture. But it's interesting that maybe it's partly the bacteria. In fact, even in the cattle industry, it's the bacteria in their gut that are producing the methane.
Yeah. Well, isn't it the CO2 which is responsible? Why the bacteria? So why would we give responsibility to bacteria? Yeah. Is it possible to talk about that? Is it?
Yeah. Well, that was my second question was, but do bacteria rule the world, in fact?
Yes, and viruses, I think, very much so. They've been around for forever, pretty much, as far as life's concerned, and they'll go on past us. They might be a bit lonelier when we go, but I think, yeah, they're definitely up there as one of the apex.
Well, the viral DNA is incorporated in our own DNA and DNA of animals and basically of all life. You can trace back little bits of viral DNA. It helps out actually to figure out how old we are and whether in evolution theory. So yeah, they do rule the world, but are they taking over us? Not yet. I mean. Pandemic, of course, but still, I think that humanity in that way has a leading role.
I mean, or are we superorganisms anyway? We're kind of communities of bacteria anyway, and viruses and things like that, which I guess throws into question the, whose fault it is. Maybe it's the bacteria in us causing us to cause climate change. That's just sort of taking a tangent there, but obviously.
Hold on. So, climate change, of course, that is. So we're talking in climate change, whereas now as if the one that is going on now, but of course the previous changes in climate. I mean, that's then, you cannot really blame anybody that happened.
It's that quote again: the farther back we can look, the farther forward we can see, because we just think about the now bit. But there is all these previous kind of events as well that we could be learning from. I guess people are learning from them.
Certainly, a recent example of something that was bad that we created, but we solved, were the hole in the ozone layer and the use of CFCs. Possibly we were able to solve it because society wasn't as dependent on CFCs as it is on sort of fossil fuels and the way that we sort of ignite that locked-in carbon, which potentially is going to be a trickier and longer process to try and sort of remove or reduce our dependency on. But that is, so we have the potential to, I guess, become less reliable on it. But it's basically, like Paul talked about yesterday as well, the large corporations that do have seem to have most of the power on the planet are so dependent on these fossil fuels that it almost feels futile at times trying to push against that.
Any other thoughts on the futility of our attempts to solve the carbon problem?
Well, yeah.
I'm struggling a bit with that one, because if you would argue saying, the bigger companies, they do have a big role in this, and sure, but so the investors that actually want to make money out of it, that they push these, they are the companies that actually want to make that money. So in the end, it's still humanity is driving that. So it's our species which has an issue with sort of draining every resource that we have.
But at the same time,
maybe we can do some nerve stimulation to get rid of that in some people. I don't know.
At the same time, the larger population are the consumers that are using the products or the commodities from the fossil fuels. So we do have a power collectively. I was playing devil's advocate a bit there.
No, my son, the economist, would agree with you.
Oh, okay.
Maybe I have a contribution to this question. Well, I'm still, in my mind is still the debate of yesterday. I was in a debate with Mark O'Connell, who wrote a book on transhumanism, and those transhumanists, they are very much obsessed with avoiding death and creating life, like Frankenstein. And then the interesting thing is that they are really apolitical. They are thinking about their individual lives, but not about the sixth extinction of life on the earth, etc. So somehow. And this is also within the climate change that I think we could easily agree on that humans should do something about it. And the very strange, for me, idiotic thing is that there are powerful parties that don't acknowledge it and don't want to cooperate to avoid the big dangers we are facing nowadays. And so my question would be, why is it so hard to acknowledge that we share a common world and we have to care together? So what ideas do make that it's so hard to acknowledge your responsibility? That would be, but maybe you can help me find an answer. I mean, that's the great scandal of our times, I would say. And maybe it's, in fact, the obsession with creating life somehow and thinking we can, the scientists' obsession with avoiding death, that it makes us irresponsible somehow. So the utopian idea that humans can control life. Yeah.
All the tools which are now around, for instance, CRISPR-Cas, it's used at the moment to change biology as we know it around us. But as soon as you start talking about CRISPR-Cas on humans, that's a big no-go. Saying no, we cannot do that. It's the ethical
It is actually
complaint.
allowed in the UK on human embryos.
I know, and the same as in China at the moment. But as soon as a scientist steps up and saying, you know what, we engineered a child, as I think a month and a half ago in China, it was a scientist that brought that up.
Hay or who?
We were just in China just after that, and there was lots of public debate around it, and obviously the government has kind of changed what's allowed now, because in the UK you're obviously not allowed to let that embryo form into a viable human, but they're trying to solve genetic illnesses and work on gene therapies, which brings me beautifully to the next question, which is what will the impact of synthetic biology be on future life?
It will be more than we can think of now. That's a bit the danger if you start mumbling around in a biological system which you don't fully understand of how it actually works. As soon as you take away one of the building stones, the building blocks, then you have an idea of saying, well, it's going to work like this, and we did research on it, we have theories about it, and then biology is that much complex that it will actually change and something else will happen. You may get a Frankenstein version
I suppose we
of
should
that.
first define as well synthetic biology, what we mean by it. Do you want to have a go at that one, or
Well,
shall I?
it's a fascinating concept because synthetic and life used to be opposed. Some people also speak of robotic life, which is also how you say in the contradiction in terminis, contradictio in terminis, and so it's in the concept already is provoking the concept of life, so to say. So it's you can is it life when you remake DNA? When you think about the bacteria as a kind of machine that you can recreate so that it will function in the way you like it to do. Well, and I maybe it's like with robotic life that the idea of what life is about will shift. I started with that idea that life is a very much a shifting notion and not something we can define for once and for all.
I think it's interesting with this, with sort of artificial life in terms of robotics. When they talk about a life, they talk about, is it alive? How will we know it's alive? It will be conscious. What is artificial consciousness? And the philosophy is not quite there to define what consciousness actually is. People don't actually know.
But
so you can't program it.
Another concept like life and like intelligence that we cannot really define. We use it as if they are scientific notions, which we can just, they're object. It's not. We can just define them, but it's in fact very normative. When we speak about intelligent life, we have a feeling about intelligence as being good, and and life is good, but all the time we really don't know what it is. It's just
Freek, do you want to say something on synthetic biology?
Well, I'm a bit hung up. So the word consciousness got me triggered. Where in the brain can I park consciousness? Point is, I still have no clue. Not that I'm done learning to say, well, there is none, but it's still a concept, indeed, as in life. These are vague terms, so to say. We don't really understand how it comes together and what it makes us think about these terms. So I'm a bit struggling with that one.
I mean,
to be
Daniel
honest.
Dennett, I think, talked about the myth of consciousness, didn't he? That it was kind of a myth, this whole idea that it's just, multiple cells working together, which give us this kind of sense that we have this thing.
Actually, yesterday I started my inaugural lecture here at the Academy building, saying that there are these very big questions of what is consciousness and what is the biological concept behind having a thought in your head, of how that comes together. And to be honest, I still cannot link, let's say, ion channels in membranes all the way down to such concepts. It's just too big.
And do you think we can find an answer on that question? So is it a question of time for the scientists?
I think technology can get us closer to finding answers like that, for sure. I mean, things like optogenetics make us understand the biological concepts of certain aspects of our behavior.
Mm-hmm. So there will be a time when we can just write down what consciousness is about.
I think humanity might be extinct before we really reach that point, because it's just too complex.
We might have all turned
that's
into a giant
bit
consciousness.
fatalistic, but, yeah.
We were talking yesterday about these kind of like giant planet-wide consciousnesses and things, so maybe that will happen.
Well, we need something to upload anyway,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it'd be good to identify that first before we upload it.
Exactly. So uploading something into the brain, for instance, that yeah.
But your question was, what will be the impact of synthetic biology on life, or on?
I just said be on. I didn't say on anything. I was just, what will the impact be? I think I left life aside.
So, kind of taking us out of the picture and putting us into the bigger picture. So, I mean, biology doesn't just mean us. So that also, my favourite, plants, plants and organisms in the soil, invertebrates, all sorts of different things that we depend on for life on the planet. Other things that drive the systems in which we inhabit. Potentially by manipulating different aspects within these things that we depend on, we could potentially stabilise the planet in some ways. Certainly for some plant diseases, there are sort of synthetic biology alternatives that we could potentially eradicate diseases that are affecting things like food security and other big issues like that. So it's quite difficult at times to think about things on a larger scale, but that, I think, for a large amount of the solutions that we definitely need to think about sort of the connectedness of ourselves and the planet.
And so we cannot rely on the natural resources anymore of the planet because we're just consuming way too much. So you need synthetic biology, for instance, in the food consumption, to say, well, let's engineer a type of rice which maybe is doing better without all the methane producing bacteria, whatever connection we can think of. Is that the way you're... Something
along those lines. And also as well, if we were going to continue to... This is my personal opinion, but if we were to continue to sort of farm cattle on a mass scale, we could potentially introduce something that would allow them to produce less methane.
They've already trialled something like that, tablets or something that are kind of probiotic yogurt drinks that reduce the methane-producing gut bacteria in cows. There is actually some research going on that, I believe.
But there is, within the thinking about synthetic biology, a big technical fix, I would say. So I know Craig Venter has this idea of solving the climate change by creating bacteria that would absorb this CO2 molecules to lower the percentage of gases in the air, and so somehow this very much fits into the line that the negative effects we produce with technology are again solved with more technology, which is very much a technical fix. And I would say that's only half of the answer. So it won't bring us further if we do not acknowledge that technology always needs a political scene in which there are several perspectives, and we have to create new practices instead of just new technology. And
can I tap in on that?
Yeah.
So what you just mentioned is saying, well, technology is causing a problem that we're solving with technology, if I may translate.
Yeah.
So I don't think technology is causing it. So we try to use technology to basically counteract the effects that humanity or human beings have. I think that makes a bit, it's more realistic to me.
Well, I would actually say, I don't know, it feels a bit safer to almost scale back the dependence that we have on that technology rather than trying to counteract it. And I think it's really important that moving forward with synthetic biology, that we kind of work with it and depend on it less, particularly if the resources that we require for the processes embedded in synthetic biology are going to be harder to come by, or
what do you mean, the resources for synthetic biology being harder to come by?
I don't know. In my head, somehow, I just imagine someone working in a lab made of a tent under sort of like a fiery sky, trying to do some working with micro. But the fact is that as it's an unknown thing. So if we can scale back our dependence on something that has an unknown future.
I think with all these things, the ship sort of sail. We've always been dependent on the new things that we invent. It's like this idea of immortality, and how old can you get before we have to start killing? We have to, we're all perfect and we're all living forever. At some point, we have to kill people off. I mean, we could have already had this discussion when life expectancy went from about 36 to 70 to 80, kind of thing. Maybe I'm too old now and I should have been killed already.
But I would argue some of these dependencies aren't life critical. So the dependency that we sometimes feel that we have on a smartphone, for example, or whatever, if that was removed, we might not find sort of different places.
I think you're showing your age there.
I
think some people might say that a smartphone was life critical.
Anyway, so what I'm saying is that we can kind of evaluate that realistically with sort of I guess with biological life in mind, and kind of work sort of towards maybe scaling that back.
So the piece of art you made there in the corner, so the story you told about, I'm not sure whether I can replicate it, but it would basically be used that you take specific parts of a biological system, which you can be somehow a scientist, you can use compartments or ideas from that to actually start saving patients or whatever, or start to form answers to bigger questions. And I think that is also one part of the impact of synthetic biology can be, that as long as we get more understanding of what biological systems actually do, that we can find, so we don't need this chemical treatment. We can just basically feed you a plant from the Amazon, and then basically you won't be affected by disease X or Y.
I mean, I know people who are actually working with plants from the Amazon to look for cures, using modifying things and trying to take out the kind of the active ingredients and things to cure tuberculosis.
So
Brighton and Sussex Medical School. They're trying to work
finding
on
new antibiotics or whatsoever. I mean, it's pretty sure that stuff is already out there. We just need to figure out where it is. So do you need synthetic biology to do that? Well, ideally, you take something which is biological, and using some sort of a technique, you can use the same biological principle in another case.
I mean, the trouble with antibiotic resistance is a lot of the low-hanging fruit of antibiotics has already been discovered. So what they're trying to do now with things like CRISPR technology is they knock out all the kind of the different parts of a bacterium to make a library of them, and then they test them, which one of these parts of the bacterium mechanisms are important for life, and how can we interfere in those parts. So this is a kind of new, these sort of genetic DNA libraries of that they're creating with bacteria and things is really useful for curing like diseases with antibiotic resistance. And I think that's going to be very important going forward. Which sort of, I think Martijn had something, but it nearly brings me on to my last question as well.
Well, I was thinking about, you mentioned immortality. And, well, we talk about the future of life, so we should also talk about immortality, maybe. And it might be that our current ideas about immortality are very specific for our times. Like the transhumanists, they have immortality as their great utopia, their fantasy. But it's very much a very individualistic type of immortality. And somehow humans always have been seeking for immortality, but in different cultural periods we thought different about this concept of immortality. So you know the old Greeks, they thought about, they hoped for becoming immortal, but you could only become immortal by doing great deeds and by building great buildings, temples, etc. So it was, and in fact you had to die immediately after this great deed, like Achilles did in Troy, because that was the only way his story could be kept in a story. And so, and well, there are, and then the Christians came and they thought, well, those stories go because cultures go, but our immortality is in the soul, so we have to die to become immortal. The soul is eternal and immortal. And then we had modernity, and then at first, in the Enlightenment, we thought about the immortality of society, in the sense that we had to create a society in which everybody would be happy, etc. But then, well, in our times, so the neoliberal times, we think very much about the individual because we cannot create society. We know it from the communist experiment, etc. But now we think the only way to become immortal is to to focus on the individual body, so to say, which is a new idea, in fact, and it might be an aberration in time because it's quite new. It's maybe 30, 50, only 100 years.
I think the personal experiences of people that actually last for 100 or 110 years, they will turn that idea around, I think, because if you read back the stories of these old people, then they're all very unhappy with the fact that they're the last one of their whole clan still being alive. Of course, they're very thankful, but at some point it's actually...
But they are lonely as well.
Exactly. It's in the end, it's a misery time. So
yeah, but the transhumanist would tell you that we all could be 130, so then it's you have your company around you still.
It's like when people were 70, when the life expectancy was 36, you could reach 70 or 80. So it's not outside of the realms of possibility with kind of scientific developments. Yeah, I mean, I think also there's this bit where you're kind of sick and getting old and stuff like that. But I think John Holder raised the question yesterday about about aging as a disease, and I mean that is a way of thinking of it. And in fact, aging is a disease because one scientist that I've worked with a bit in the past, who's the professor of biogerontology at Brighton University, works on cell senescence and these diseases that children have where they age very rapidly. So they have the body of an elderly person. And he thinks that the similar mechanisms for treating that might actually have implications for life extension as well.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. No. Well, I have a son, he's 21 years old, and he's studying nanobiology. And why does he study this? Because he really wants to find the secret of life. He wants to rebuild it like Frankenstein. And then I asked him, of course, why would you like to live forever? And he said, well, I want to celebrate life. And then my answer was, well, doesn't it, when you accept death as a something which is there, maybe it's the better way to celebrate life. So it's this opposition all the time, as if death is a scandal, but maybe death and the ability to die, not only for individuals, but also for societies and maybe for life on Earth, or for is the condition for living and for celebrating life, so to say. We somehow we have to rethink these concepts, also to reappreciate them, I think.
So in a way, the future of life is death. In a way, it's inherent in it.
Well,
I wanted to kind of just sort of wrap up with leading into of this bit before I open it up. Okay. So you still get to say the thing. Whatever. And just sort of bring and just sort of say, well, maybe you're answering my other question about will a new pandemic come and wipe us out, because that's kind of perhaps integral in one of these scenarios. But I wanted to, at this point, unless are you desperate to say something, Chris?
Well,
say it.
A bit, yeah.
Yeah, go on.
So I
then
guess traditionally, if that's the word, the immortality thing biologically would be to have as many offspring as possible, and then again your genetics are, I guess, going to live on sort of in perpetuity, and so I guess that's sort of removing our sort of ourself really, and thinking us as more about biological entities. But that also has ramifications for overpopulation and all sorts of things as well. But that was just the point that I wanted to make.
Yeah, but then our consciousness, whatever that is, would die. And at that point, with that completely confusing thought, I'd like to open it up to the audience as well. I think there's a question there at the front from Alex. Do you want to wave?
I just wanted to go back to Chris's question from earlier, which was coming from Paul's talk from yesterday, about the big companies being the major contributor to climate change. And it occurred to me that we've kind of been through a scenario like this in the past sort of 20 years with tobacco companies. They did a very similar thing where there was lots of money involved. They polluted the scientific consensus. Yeah, so there was
of doubt.
Yeah, I mean, and it was initially promoted as a very cool, no health concerns at all, and then everyone was going, no, smoking's really bad for you, and they go, no, it's fine. We're not sure, and is this not the same as what we're doing? We don't have a full consensus on climate change. There's people lobbying governments to muddy the waters, and it was only when they were legally challenged by people who died, and people got together and challenged them and forced them to start paying out, that the money dried up, and this push towards everyone who has now, there's been legislation and people who've given up in droves, and I applaud anyone who went through that, including myself. Can we, should we be looking at that model for these companies involved in affecting climate?
Who would like to go first?
I'll give a shot. As long as it's for the general population, it's very easy, and it's not going to affect themselves a lot to be more climate neutral. Then it's going to work. Then but as long as it's going to cost a lot of money or whatsoever, then you will never be able to turn around the general public within let's say a short span of time, within a year or so. Then it's going to take a generation maybe to wash out those ideas. But in the end, I do think you have a point that
it is a good parallel with what happened in the tobacco industry, that's for sure. But it has bigger implications, this one. Yeah.
I am relatively positive that the consumers and the people of the planet can do a relatively good job at putting pressure onto different groups to get some change. But I also fear that, I'll be brutally honest, that I think we're far too responsive to things like this. And the world will be a slightly more changed place than we would have liked it to have been by the time we get to that stage. But I think it's definitely within our generation we will see that change, and I think with things like with other issues and other related issues, like things like, again, I mentioned food security earlier, and issues such as so there'll be an increase in climate change. Migrations of people, of animals, of plants, and all sorts of different organisms. It is really going to get to a head when something will have to be done.
Well, I agree very much with you. It's not easy to, it's not difficult to answer. But it's what happened in the tobacco story is that people had to rediscover what power is, that you can make power by acting in concert. And the climate change case is very much about that as well. So many of these, well, as long as it is within the science debate, whether how much degrees we will have in the end, then it's still depoliticized. But I think, yeah, indeed, the tobacco, your example shows how important it is to come together and to feel this responsibility for our common world, which those powerful parties in fact deny. They have released themselves or loosened themselves from the world as if it's not a shared world, but as if it's only their play in it. Well.
Any other questions? Yes. If you wait for the mic, it's just coming.
So, how do you account for the impact of individual greed in your respective fields, or rather, in the optimism and the hope of your field? Because you can have a hope that humanity as a whole can achieve all these things, we can live forever, we can fix everything, but of course that's not available to everyone. It's only some, and I think the problem right now is that greed that is going to extremes. So how do you see that playing out? Is it going to be evened out, or is it going to break things?
Is it what? Going
to break things. So are we past the point that human greed is actually going to mean only some are going to survive and the rest we're done for? Or is there hope for the whole of humanity?
The vice of greed, you mean, yeah. It's a difficult question, but somehow greed has to do with fear of dying. Greed is a way to be safe. When I have this property, I have a kind of the idea of a guarantee that I will be safe for a certain amount of time. So greed indeed it also prevents us from sharing the world somehow, because you think you will be safe when you have your own part. But I don't know if I answer your question with it. But
I'm curious about so you all have an opinion, and an optimist opinion, a hopeful opinion based on your discipline of how you see things moving forward. So my question is more about how do you see the impact or the reality of greed, and do you think optimism will triumph in the end and we will find ways to move forward, or whether you think I can be optimist, but actually we've got a problem here and it's not a certain future?
Well, my optimism would be based on the fact that when looking to history, there are always these mechanisms. So there's always the power play, and it's always that people rediscover the power of politics. Well, the fall of the German Republic, so the DDR, is a nice example where somehow, well, I visited in '88, and it was still totally invisible that it would be fallen apart within a year. And it was really a velvet revolution taking place. Then it fell apart because people rediscovered their own power somehow. Mm-hmm. And of course the people in charge of the government, they felt they must have felt it somehow. Well, but so history learns that people can always reinvent. So totalitarian regimes or powerful regimes are always short-living. When we,
I think
so my optimism would be based on that.
Are we thinking about ourselves though as outside of nature, in that we're actually just part of it, because we sort of see ourselves in these two sort of roles, but we're actually part of nature, so we are like the bacteria in the petri dish competing for space and things. So this greed thing's just like the normal thing that any microorganism would also, I guess, be doing in a different way. It's always been from the beginning of evolution, possibly.
It's survival, right? I mean, we need to survive, and at some point you go into that modus, and greed is one of the translations of the survival modus, I would say.
But who is the we? Who is the we? We want to survive.
The human species.
Well, yeah, but is it all life, or what is? Yeah, what is?
To respond to your question, I'm optimistic because I do believe in the power of people and the power of communities to pull together, which sounds a bit of a cheesy thing, I guess, these days.
Lovely.
But it's but again, so through education, we see that in the curriculum in the UK at primary school all the way up, that things like environmental messaging are slowly becoming embedded. And children are learning about the effects that they have on the environment and those sorts of things. We're starting to see, I mean, again, it's only an example, but there are lots more single-use plastic-free schools about in the world, which certainly, you know, and that's only a revolution over the last few years. Through through the media and the way that things are communicated. So there was, I can't remember exactly the statistics, but with the Blue Planet programme in the UK, that was predominantly about marine plastics, that had a knock-on effect where people started looking at their diet and their lifestyle and how that affected the planet. So there are real nuggets of hope out there. So I remain positive, and I'm quite happy to put my faith in other people and the planet, because, you know, inherently I think we are good and nice. Some less not, but we won't go into that now. And also the greed thing as well. I think, like you say, I think that will always be there. But I think if we can focus on the power of what we can do together rather than the power that those guys have, I think there'll be more strength in that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions? Yes, I think there's one there in the middle. Wave up your...
Yeah, so I was thinking about the thing you said about bacteria also competing each other, and that you also always have this kind of greed aspect in society, and the way we interact with the world. but I think there's also something like coevolution and symbiosis, and I think so. Many people think that as a species, to survive, you have to dominate and to expand and those kind of things. But I think in the end, what would be really clever if we find a way to find out how we can use the ecosystem or the ecological processes in such a way that we don't throw out trash that can't be taken up or decomposed anymore. And I was just as a comment on the greed thing, I don't think greed is a necessary implication of survival. Yeah.
Somebody want to pick up on that?
I think I agree with her.
I would say that the idea of greed, again, is sort of, it relates to the movie that was shown on the first night that I introduced, this Genesis 2.0. It's a religious idea that these things are kind of wrong. It's like, avarice and gluttony are sins. And these kind of things override our sort of ethical principles, even though we don't notice that they are, even if we're not religious. They sort of impinge on this. And I made the daring comment in the introduction of the movie that maybe for real ethical kind of debate on future life sciences, that maybe we should park the religious arguments. And I think this greed concept is sort of couched in religious ethics.
Greed is hubris, like hubris over. But it's not for nothing a religious thing. But I think we can also see it in a secular way. So, in response to this, I think greed very much also denies this relation we have with the other, with nature or with the other people, for example. So at the cost of the other, at the cost of nature or at the cost of other people in society, we try to save something for ourselves, hoping we will survive. But somehow this denies that we are dependent on nature and on the others to live on. So it's an illusion in the end. This is nicely told in the story, The Christmas Carol, for example. Well, how was this greedy man? Scrooge, yeah. Well, in the end, he finds out that he's very dependent on the others, and
the biggest hoarders are the people who've usually lost stuff in psychology. The people that have these hoarding issues where they keep everything, and that's a kind of greed. You could say some of them are shopaholics, and some of them are, cat hoarders or whatever. They've lost people and things in their earlier life, and so that's kind of protection mechanism. So it's sort of down to psychology as well, which maybe we could sort of improve with some deep brain stimulation, perhaps.
I think the ethics will prevent us from doing so, but obsessive compulsive disorder, for instance, people that were severely affected, their quality of life is very much improved. Yeah. So perhaps if the ethical discussions will allow it, or at least the conclusion from that, who knows? But for that, to be honest, to be really on the safe side, I think a lot more research needs to be done to actually figure out how all of that biological concept comes about. Yeah.
Did you want to say anything else on that point?
No.
Okay, we've got one last question, I think. Ariane's grabbed the mic. Sorry.
We can have two last questions.
Okay, two last questions.
My question is for all on the panel, including Anna. And ideally, I'd like to have an answer in a percentage. And I'm not trying to muddy the waters here, but there have been extinctions and climate changes before humans were on the planet. If you would, and I think part of the current climate change is caused by developments that are not caused by humans, so beyond our control, and part of it is caused by us, the effects of our doings on this planet. How would you see the percentage of the current climate change? And I think, Freek, you said humans are the leading cause for climate change, so that would be more than 50%.
Exactly.
How do you see, or what does science say? I mean, I'm not an expert here, on which part of the climate change is beyond our control and which part is caused by humans?
So I'm a layman on this topic. I'm very much influenced by media. Whether that is fake news or not, I don't know. But if you twist my arm and make me say a percentage, I will be at 80%. I don't see any geological activity or whatsoever that can cause this rapid rise in basically any factor that we see, or the diminishment of glaciers or whatsoever, apart from what we are causing. So that will be my percentage, but now I dare the other ones to call a percentage.
But is it important?
No, first say percentage.
To know.
Yes.
There's a joke in the Netherlands of the elephant and the mice walking on the bridge, and the mice said, well, we're really rocking the bridge. How futile would our attempts be to counter climate change if we are only causing 10% of it? That's the reason of my question.
I would sort of say, 75, 80. It's very similar to Freek, but also certainly since the early onset of the Anthropocene, what we've been able to do as well is measure ocean acidification, which is a real indicator of sort of the light carbon in the air, because the oceans turn much more acidic, and there's all sorts of marine microorganisms that rely on the calcified calcium in their shells that are really showing effects. And again, a lot of these organisms are right at the bottom of the food chain that so much more depends on. So, and it's like getting close to sort of the oceans in some areas of the country are slowly getting in as much as almost maybe 1.5 pH more acidic, which is and that's a measured scientific fact as well. So and that is since the onset of the Anthropocene, and because there have been only a few minor sort of volcanic activities and things in the past compared to what's happened previously on the planet. The parts per million of carbon that have been in the atmosphere would be considered negligible certainly over the last century. So I think we've got a lot to answer for.
Yeah, well, well, it's not humans as such that are creating the. I think there's a high percentage, but it's not humans. All humans of the world. It's a very specific group living in a very modern Western life with cars and industries, etc. So, if we are going to dive into this discussion about numbers, then then it would be important to point at that as well. So it's not just humans that's confusing the subject. But still, I think we shouldn't get lost in the discussion about guilt. We have a problem. Yeah? So let's look ahead and form coalitions and solve the problem without accusing and to get lost in accusing. It should be about peace, not about war and fines, etc.
I have very little idea on the percentage, so I'm going to say 50-50. I'm also going to say, in response to Chris's statement about the seas getting more acidic, perfect weather for an Archaea bot. So I think that would be a very nice thought. My Archaea love high acid conditions, so they'll be happy with the new situation, probably.
Yeah.
in the long run. Some people say I'm a little bit nihilistic sometimes, but anyway. And we have one last question there.
It's not a climate change, but it is talking about greed. I would like to propose the term arrogance here, you know, because, and we didn't really talk about that, because it's really, really difficult, and I think it's part of the Anthropocene that we also see how we constantly kind of put ourselves in the center. I'm also thinking about, for instance, when you talk about bacteria and how we intervene, think of Luciana Parisi, who wrote for a project we did like 4 years ago already, about our nano interventions and how we have no clue how that intervenes in these bacteria who work together. You know, they have a consciousness together, not single, they work together, and how that even kind of intervenes into history. So yeah, that is, I would like to ask that, you know, like how, but also in medical aspects, you know, most of the time we use, in Dutch you say, the bottebel. We just do something and then see what happens, and sometimes for the good and sometimes for the... I have a son with a deep brain stimulator, so I know we were lucky, but that's how it works, you know, it's still... And so this arrogance could, you know, could have perhaps some... that we share some thoughts about that as well.
Perhaps I'm the first one to respond a bit to that, but so the approach that then would have been taken by saying, well, the last resort there is saying, so all the pharmaca didn't work or whatsoever, and we go into deep brain stimulation, then I wouldn't say that goes in. I don't see the arrogance linked to that, to be honest, but it's sort of the boldness of saying, well, we need to do something, so this is our approach, and this is where we go for. So I'm struggling a little bit to link that to arrogance.
Arrogance because we think we know what we are doing.
I think it's good practice for anybody that's saying, well, that with what we know, and then this could be an option that might provide some benefit. I think that is if that type of statement is made, I think that then you can throw arrogance away, because that is to the best of your own knowledge. Might be that it's going to work, that it's not going to work. But that's mostly about communication, to be honest, for me.
Well, we have very much an idea of the scientist who is humble, serving nature, so to say, and serving society with making nice new artifacts like deep brain stimulation. So you're turning it around somehow, and maybe, but I understand your notion of arrogance in this context, and somehow I think we condition this. We condition the hubris of the expert, so to say. And this is because I think we make a shift very much, a division between society. Society is about norms and social practices and desires and politics and interests. And then we have science and technology, and then we have disinterested experts. We give them our wish, we want to be healthy, and then they, in the black box, they make a new artifact to make us healthy, and then it comes out. But it's not, it's by this division we depoliticize the process of making technology, designing it, and somehow we do as if it works, as it is coming out of the black box. Though then we forget about all the different perspectives in society, the advantaged and the disadvantaged, etc. So, the arrogance comes from this model we have, I think, by making a divide between experts and laymen, so by the depoliticization of technology. Can you maybe?
Also
it's a difficult answer,
also,
but
again, the divide between us humans and nature. I mean, that's an arrogance as well. You know, like that's also how
that one
mean,
I do feel. Yeah.
As a botanist, I'll do my best with this one. So I think there's, I think you raise a really interesting question, because when you kind of go down to the sort of you drill into the bare bones of any scientific research, there's decisions that get made about whether, you know, right at the beginning of, you know, why are we doing this? Why are we investing money and people and budget or whatever into doing this, and that whole thing as well. And there's ethics policies that kind of will go through, you know, does it do this, does it do that? Is it what is the benefit of doing this for humanity or mankind or whatever? But so it's very important to consider all of these things, but maybe arrogance is too strong a word for sort of like a, I don't know, the educated response to a problem, maybe, or I don't know, but help me out here.
So, actually, to be honest, maybe I can turn back the question into the public, into the audience, and saying, well, if we've had greed and now we have arrogance, and how do you see the difference, but also the link to each other? So perhaps maybe we can have two microphones in the public, in the audience.
I mean, I think when we talk about arrogance, it's about also defining what does it mean. How do you define arrogance? And I think I would have to say, to me, arrogance, without looking it up, has a degree of irrationality. If it has rationality behind it, if it has the facts and the figures and the study and everything on, it's not so much arrogance, because then that is just a form of communication of the tone of the person, but it's all based on fact. Then I have a difficulty seeing arrogance in that. So maybe the rationality or irrationality of it is what makes a difference. In terms of moving back then to greed, I think you could do the same thing. Irrational greed is indeed the fear of letting go. So there's certain people who will try to keep for themselves as much as they can at the expense of others. That's irrational, and therefore it's greedy and all kinds of bad things. But when it's done in a way that puts the benefits of some and the others and measures it and comes to a decision, then is less greed and more, I don't know, more thought through policy. So maybe it's that irrationality that makes a difference.
Thank you. I mean, I think just to wind up, I would also say that, I mean, the arrogant scientists are the ones that hit the headline, the people trying to kind of reverse engineer super flu and things like that. They're the ones we hear about a lot. But there's a lot of kind of everyday medical research going on in medical schools and universities. And actually, people are desperate for things like Parkinson's disease patients. We had an event at Brighton and Sussex Medical School, and there was somebody who'd gone through deep brain stimulation and been cured and has become an artist afterwards, was giving a talk, and the whole audience were Parkinson's disease patients who all never got a chance to talk to people about it and didn't come together in these ways, and they were all desperate and they wanted this treatment and they wanted to know how it worked and things like that. So and they will literally say, well, I'll try this, I can't live like this. And so there's the pressure on medics to solve this. And if you've got an Ebola outbreak and you're trying to rapidly invent a cure for that, you're going to try all sorts of things. So I think there's the pressure stuff as well. Did you want to finish very briefly on that?
I'm just
but very
nodding.
brief. One last, yeah.
do you have a response to that? To saying what the
Sure.
desperate part?
It is. I recognize that from a personal level.
Yes.
Sure. You know, there's a desperate part. So yes, and what I said, we were lucky there. But you do understand then that it's like, you know, we for you also in the medical, but in every field, it is our mistakes that suddenly, you know, appear to be, you know, helping us another step, yeah. But the arrogance is also even more broad, you know, because thinking or having a discussion about the Anthropocene is the same thing, you know. It might be linked a bit to what Ion was talking about, like how much percent, you know, and of course it's interesting to discuss that, you know, whether it's human or non-human, because I think we should think in relations much more. So that's a problem as well. But it might be seen also as an arrogance to think about, to even coin the term Anthropocene, yes? So there have been discussions about that as well, you know. So yeah, on the one hand, yeah, we certainly are a main factor in this climate change, but the fact that we again put ourselves as a human species in the center is also part of the problem.
I think
that is also the level of arrogance that I was talking about.
I think we're going to finish up here because we've got a whole rest of the programme to conclude. But I mean, and later on today, well, after this, we've got a demonstration of the biocomputation robots. And then at 7 p.m. today, I highly recommend anyone who loves bacteria or is vaguely interested in bacteria, you will come out of the keynote today loving bacteria and possibly being obsessed with them. You may choose to forget what career you're in and become a microbiologist, or at least become a bacteria tourist. And so that's coming up at 7. But I think I'm really pleased that we've had this fascinating panel and that we've really, I think, really clarified that life is, we're not sure. Consciousness, we don't understand. It may or may not be our fault. Chris is positive about everything, mostly.
Positive, it kind of is our fault.
Okay, and everything's going very well. So, and I think that's where science is as well. We are now in a situation where we know a lot more that we don't know stuff. We used to be more naive, and at least we now know how little we know. And on that note, I think we'll end this panel. And I'm very pleased to thank Martijntje and Freek and Chris. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.